All right, so let's continue on with the Cold War here and talk about some of the other big events. We had kind of already discussed the cause of the Cold War, the conferences, Tehran, Yalta, of course, being very important, Potsdam, and then some of this idea of containment. So that's essentially what we're doing here. We're going to kind of come back to that and talk about this containment policy again and how it had an important effect on the Cold War period of time. All right, so here. So we have the story of Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is one of the more famous events associated with the Cold War. So what's the deal with Cuba, and why do I have a map of Europe up? And I'll show you as we get through the story here why this map of Europe is important for the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in 1959, Castro becomes the ruler of Cuba. There was a man named before there, Batista. You don't need to know his name, but Castro comes in 1959, initially supported by the United States. Very quickly turns around and says, I'm a communist and my loyalties are with the Soviet Union. And so he says his loyalties are with the Soviet Union. That upsets the US. Where things get really more intense is when Castro then says, I am going to now build nuclear missile silos. He doesn't say, we discover that they're building nuclear missile silos inside of Cuba. This is like, what, 70 miles off the coast of Florida. And so this was all orchestrated by the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was the ruler of the Soviet Union at the time. Kennedy, of course, the president of the United States. And so the US discovers that the Soviet Union on the island of Cuba is building these nuclear missile silos. And we're very concerned about this because if you think about it, if you have nuclear missiles that close to the United States, if the Soviet Union launches an attack first, you don't even have a chance to fire back before everything is gone, right, in a nuclear missile attack. And so Kennedy said we were not going to stand for this, and he created a blockade around Cuba, around the island of Cuba. And we also had mobilized thousands and thousands and thousands of troops on the coast of Florida, all with the idea of going down in there and invading if need be. So now you're in that massive game of chicken. What do you do? Because the Soviet Union now, are they going to run through this American blockade or not? And if they do, you could trigger World War III, and by now both sides have nuclear weapons. So this goes on for almost 2 weeks, and it's 2 really intense weeks. Everybody knew what was going on. It was in the news. If you talk to people of that generation, they'll tell you nobody knew what was going to happen, and it was really, really a kind of scary moment during the Cold War period. What had happened, of course, as the story goes, is Khrushchev pulled the missiles out and of Cuba, and the United States had this great victory because they were able to force Khrushchev to pull the missiles out of Cuba. But that's not the whole story. Yes, that happened. But look, we had missiles in Turkey. And if you could see Turkey here, you see how close Turkey is to the Soviet Union. And part of the arrangement in the Cuban Missile Crisis is that we had to pull our missiles out of Turkey that were facing the Soviet Union. And so there was a little bit of give and take here, but you could see how the Cold War was a very tense event, and the Cuban Missile Crisis really is a good example of that. So that's it. Those are the kind of the key things you need to know. The names, Kennedy, Castro, Khrushchev, know about the exchange of the missiles. You know, they took their missiles out of Cuba, we took our missiles out of Turkey, and just the intensity of that moment in time was pretty severe. All right, so that's the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1960s. Meanwhile, we have another really important event in the 1960s into the 1970s, and that's the Vietnam War. So this is a big event in U.S. history. Again, if you take a U.S. history class, I would hope you spend more time on it than a Western Civ class. But I am going to go through some of the key points of the Vietnam War. We have our map. We have some key words here, so let me go through this. So the deal with Vietnam, and I'm just going to stay on this map as we go through all the key words here. The deal with Vietnam is that it was controlled by the French. If you remember, during the French colonization period, the French colonized this area, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, that whole area, and eventually the French leave during decolonization. When the French leave, they didn't leave a very stable situation, and Vietnam ended up getting split in half on what we call the 17th parallel. Again, you don't need to memorize that parallel, but you could see it there on the map here. And just like in Korea, the North fell under communism, the South was supposed to be under a democratic regime. The North was ruled by this communist dictator, a man named Ho Chi Minh. The South was led by a man named Diem. And the United States, of course, wanted the South under this communist Cold War period of time to remain free and not be absorbed and controlled by communist North Vietnam. The North also had the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were communists moving into South Vietnam. So the Viet Cong are the communists in South Vietnam, creating havoc, trying to destroy South Vietnam, trying to make it so that they break them, right? They want to break the South, so they end up falling under communism. So when Kennedy was president of the United States, this is still during the Kennedy administration, the United States ended up moving what were called military advisors, right? Military advisors to Vietnam. And these quote unquote military advisors are soldiers. They moved these soldiers into South Vietnam with a job of essentially stopping the Viet Cong. It wasn't working too well. Meanwhile, another important point worth mentioning is Diem had failed miserably in stopping the Viet Cong. So much so that Diem was assassinated. And who assassinated Diem? Well, a lot of people don't know this, but the United States, right? The U.S. actually assassinated Diem because they thought he was becoming corrupt, unreliable, that the spread of communism there was very serious. And so Diem was actually assassinated. So this is kind of an interesting little side story. So with that, the Viet Cong now are going through South Vietnam, and the fighting intensifies. As the fighting intensifies in Vietnam, first it was under Kennedy, then Kennedy's assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson becomes the president of the United States, continues under his administration. Then Nixon is elected, continues under his administration, right? So it goes through three different administrations. And the problem with the Vietnam War that was very difficult to fight is very often you don't know who your friends are and who your enemies are. And during the war, it was very often the situation where you go into a village, and let's say you're an American soldier, you go into a village, and you don't know if that village there has Viet Cong people. And one of the things the Viet Cong would do, for example, is they would kind of get dressed up like a woman with a baby carriage, and they would move this baby carriage toward a group of American soldiers, except it was a bomb. They would leave it, run away, bomb would go off, American soldiers would be killed. So if you're an 18, 19-year-old soldier and you walk into a village, you don't know who your friend is, you don't know who your enemy is, and this oftentimes led to a lot of tragic civilian casualties during the Vietnam War. One of the things that happened fighting this war that was so difficult was the attitude. It's two things that made this war difficult. One, the fighting, the terrain, not knowing who your friends were, who your enemies were, but also what was going on in the home front. Because at home, American soldiers were vilified like no other time in U.S. history. That the American soldiers at home were called baby killers. They were attacked. They were spat on. It was really, really horrible if you were an American soldier coming back from Vietnam. Talk to anybody who fought from that period of time. And, the reality is, were there events that happened that American soldiers did horrible things? Yes, like there's something called the My Lai Massacre, right? The My Lai Massacre was when American soldiers entered a village full of civilians. They knew they were civilians, and they killed them. But the My Lai Massacre was the exception that a lot of people in the United States made the rule. We see this very often where, you take the exception, make the rule. You can have 99.9% of people doing their job right, doing the right thing, but people focus on the 0.1% that have done something wrong. And that's what ends up happening. And so the protest of the Vietnam War came in a couple ways. There were some people who protested the Vietnam War in what is, perfectly acceptable. You protest the war because you don't believe we should fight, and there's nothing wrong with protesting a war. That's support a war, protest a war. Both things are fine. That's what happens in a free society. But what was also happening in the Vietnam War is people were not just protesting the war. In some instances, they were literally cheering for American soldiers to be killed. Talk to somebody who, again, fought in the Vietnam War. Ask them about Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda went to Vietnam. She sat with the Viet Cong. She cheered for Ho Chi Minh. And she is just hated by people of the Vietnam Veteran Society because it's like it's one thing to oppose a war, it's another thing to literally cheer for American soldiers to be killed. And that was happening. So can you imagine if you're an American soldier, how hard that makes it to fight a war? So it was very difficult. And so what ends up happening, of course, as the story goes, is eventually by 1975, we pull out of Vietnam and the Vietnam era is lost. The Vietnam War is lost because as soon as we pull out in 1975, the South falls. And when the South falls, then all of Vietnam becomes communism. So while in the Korean War, we were able to save South Korea, in the Vietnam War, we weren't. And so people often say we lost the Vietnam War, which is accurate, but it's not the full story. I have two other terms here that I hadn't talked about yet. The Paris Peace Accords and the city called Hanoi. So a lot of people aren't even taught this, and this is a shame because it needs to be taught to get the full picture of the Vietnam War. So right before 1973, in 1972, we bombed the city of Hanoi. Hanoi is up here in North Vietnam. We bombed it, we bombed it, we bombed it, we bombed it so much that in 1973, ready for this? The North was ready to surrender. That's what happened in the Paris Peace Accords. In the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, the North said to the Americans, what do you want? And we said we want the South to be free, we want free elections, we want free press, we want our soldiers back. And the North said, okay. And 1973, we had basically won the Vietnam War. What happened in the next 2 years? Well, what happened in the next 2 years is Watergate took place in the United States. When Watergate took place, if you're not familiar about that story, it's more for U.S. history. It forced President Nixon to resign. When Nixon resigned, all the support towards South Vietnam ended. And when the support to South Vietnam ended, that's when the tide of the war turned again. We pulled our soldiers out and the South fell. So there are people who argue that we could have maintained the South. It could have been free. It would have been a longer war. More people would have died. And there are, of course, other people, I always like to give the different perspective, say, you know, the whole war shouldn't have been fought in the first place, that, you know, we didn't need to put any troops in there from the beginning. The South would have fallen anyways, but then all the casualties that happened wouldn't have taken place. So, you know, these are the different perspectives that you have when you study something like the Vietnam War. But I always want students to know the whole story. And so, you know, make sure you know about the Paris Peace Accords and Hanoi and all of that. So I hope that's clear. That's a very basic overview of the Vietnam War. Again, there's much more to it in a U.S. history class. Hopefully you get a nice balanced view of the story too in there. But that's a little brief version of it. All right, so that's the Vietnam War and the South falls. One other event associated with this, just real briefly, Cambodia. Cambodia had a communist ruler. Cambodia, right next to Vietnam, had this communist ruler named Pol Pot. And I just want people to know about this because a lot of people don't. Pol Pot was a murderous thug. He had his group called the Khmer Rouge. And what you see here is the evidence of his massacres. 1 million people were killed under his communist regime in Cambodia. So at the very least, I want you to be familiar with this as yet another example of a communist regime that just massacred people, and it's just absolutely eerie and horrific. So as long as you know that, that's fine. All right, we move on. All right, one positive thing that comes out of the Cold War for sure is the space race, right? And the space race was a Cold War event. It starts, of course, with the Soviet Union getting this satellite called Sputnik that all it did was beep, 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 but still freaked everybody out. What is this thing doing up there beeping? And this, of course, leads to the space race and the moon race, right? And all of that. And so there we have the Apollo missions, and the Apollo missions were, you know, the race to the moon was not this just scientific endeavor. It was a political event because of the Cold War, that we needed to get there before the Soviet Union. And to really illustrate this, I put this up, 4%. 4% of our national budget was being spent on the Apollo missions during the 1960s. Again, to give you perspective, we spent like a decimal of a percentage point, a fraction of a percentage point our entire space program today. So this is much more money than we had ever spent today in our space program because it was such a big part of the Cold War. And so, of course, we did get to the moon and the moon landing, and one of the more dramatic scientific achievements in human history. So that's pretty cool. It was one of the things, and a lot of technologies that we've developed since then from the space race. So a lot of amazing things that have impacted our lives positively have come from that as well. So anyways, that's just kind of one little story I always like to make sure people know about. And yes, of course, the moon landing did happen. If you want to find, there's a funny YouTube clip of Buzz Aldrin, and Buzz Aldrin was just being hounded by this crazy guy one time who was demanding that he swear on the Bible that he landed on the moon, and he's one of these guys and denies the moon landing happened. And Buzz Aldrin, who's very old, just smacked him in the face. It's kind of funny, but you can try to find that if you want. So anyway, so that's the space race that was going on, of course, throughout the 1960s and the moon landing, which at one point the Soviet Union was ahead of us, but we caught up and we passed them after they had a pretty big accident, and we were able to get there first. So pretty cool story. All right, Europe in the 1950s and 60s, just briefly. So we talked about Europe in the 40s. This is a crazy picture. I'll explain it. By 1950s, basically, and 60s, a lot of these Eastern Bloc nations, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, for example, basically said, we don't want to be part of the Soviet bloc anymore. We don't want to be in here. And the Soviet Union said, well, too bad. And in 1956, Hungary was invaded by Soviet forces and forced to stay in the Soviet sphere of influence. There was an Olympic match in 1956, and there was this water polo match, and it's kind of called the blood in the water match, because if anybody ever played water polo, it's pretty brutal, but you see this image here. This is during this match between Hungary and the Soviet Union. Excuse me. Sneeze. Hungary and the Soviet Union. And the players were so angry that they literally just beat each other up, and it was said that the pool was red with blood by the time the match was over. So, and again, there's nothing anybody's going to do about this because these were not NATO nations. Same thing in Czechoslovakia. In 1968, the Soviets put 500,000 troops into Czechoslovakia. And so these Eastern Bloc nations did not want to be under Soviet control, but they were not under NATO. The U.S. isn't going to, what are they going to do, fight a war against 500,000 Soviet troops to liberate Czechoslovakia? It was just very difficult to do. And so these were things that were happening in Europe during the 1950s and 60s. Tremendous brutality in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all of these Eastern Bloc nations. So then the question comes, well, what ends the Cold War? What's finally going to end this? So let's kind of briefly talk about how the Cold War does come to an end. And there's a lot of people involved with the end of the Cold War, and I've got a few people here I want to start with, and there are people from outside and there are people from inside. So these are the people from the outside that probably played the biggest role in the 1980s, right? These are all figures from the 1980s that helped bring about the Cold War, end of the Cold War, where it went from containment to how do we break the Soviet Union. So I'm hoping you know these individuals. Ronald Reagan, of course, President of the United States. Reagan, just kind of crazy how divided basically since I think the year 2000, our nation has been, where every election is very close. People don't like whoever wins. Everybody's split. Ronald Reagan, when he ran for election, won 49 states during his re-election campaign. 49 states he won. So I often kind of point to him as the last president that really had at least an ability. Not everybody loved Reagan, of course, but at least had this ability to have a consensus around the nation that, yeah, this is somebody that we can all get behind. He had incredibly positive messages. He was a great orator, a great speaker, and he was the President of the United States, and of course, very, very popular, even today with a lot of people in the United States. Margaret Thatcher, she was the Prime Minister of England at the time, is there right by Reagan. She was nicknamed the Iron Lady because she was very tough. And then the Pope at the time, Pope John Paul II. So how did these individuals play a role in helping end the Soviet Union. Well, Reagan and Thatcher, their philosophy was, let's build up our military. Build up our military, force the Soviet Union to do the same. Under the philosophy that we could build up our military and still have a strong economy. The Soviet Union couldn't do that, and the economy was thriving during the Reagan administration. We were growing really well every year. There were pretty good economic booms almost the entire period of the 1980s. So we were able to do both things. The Soviet Union was not. So that was one approach. Another approach was Afghanistan. And the Soviet Union had invaded this. I covered this in my Middle East class in much more detail, History 165. But the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and the United States helped the people in Afghanistan fight the Soviet Union to the point where the Soviet Union had to get out of Afghanistan. And it cost them a lot of money, a lot of men. Sometimes Afghanistan is kind of referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, because they spent a lot of time and money and effort in there, and they had nothing to show for it. So you have that. That was an event. And then you had the Pope. The Pope is from Poland, Pope John Paul II. And he very much talked about the evils of communism. And in Poland, there was a whole movement called the Solidarity Movement that was about getting Poland to be free. And they were oftentimes encouraged by Pope John Paul II to fight against communism and to support freedom of people's rights. And, one of the characteristics of communism, of course, is no religion. So the Pope had a couple of reasons to support this. He's from Poland. He wants religious freedom. And so these individuals put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union, and they played a big role. Now, so did Kennedy, so did other presidents before, but, these were the key guys in the 1980s. But for all the pressure from these individuals from the outside, you needed people from the inside as well to really bring the changes. And that happened also in the 1980s. So who's from the inside? This guy, Mikhail Gorbachev. So definitely want to know Gorbachev. He was the leader of the Soviet Union, a communist leader of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, right around the mid-1980s. And he's different than all the other communist rulers because in the 1980s, he comes up with these two terms that you want to know, glasnost and perestroika. What do those terms mean? Glasnost means openness, perestroika means reform. And essentially what he's saying is we need more openness, more reform. We need to be a more open society. We need to let people have more freedoms. We can't have this hard line, Stalin, Khrushchev, communist, ideology. Maybe we need to let people go to churches. Maybe we need to be more open with our events in our society, not be so closed and so forth. Well, that individual, Gorbachev, talking like this, what is that going to make people in the Eastern Bloc nations, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, think? They're like, maybe we have a chance to have a little bit more freedom. And so as he's talking this way, and you have Reagan, very famous story of Reagan going to the Berlin Wall in the 1980s and giving a big speech there in the 1980s. And he goes, Mr. Gorbachev, if you really believe in this openness and reform, then tear down this wall. And, it just resonated. And it was very, very interesting story. And Reagan gave that speech. If you've never seen that speech, go and find it. He was told, Reagan was told, don't say that. You're going to just totally tick them off and it's going to create problems. But Reagan's like, no, I'm going to make this speech just like that. And it resonated. How did it resonate? Well, let me show you. You're going to have uprisings throughout Eastern Europe. Every one of these kind of little stars are in these Eastern European nations in 1989, 1990, where people are just saying enough is enough is enough. We want freedom, right? We want to break away from the Soviet Union. And then things get really crazy because then we get to 1991 and you turn on the news one day and Gorbachev is ill. That's what you hear. Gorbachev is ill. And you hear Gorbachev is ill, and now what does that mean? What that means is that he wasn't actually ill. What it means is that there was a coup, that there was an attempted by the hardline communist, okay? The hardline communist attempted to take Gorbachev and take him out of power. Why? Because they were seeing Eastern Europe fall apart. as they were seeing Eastern Europe, they're losing grips of Eastern Europe. They thought Gorbachev was soft, and therefore we need to take him out of power. And they do. For 3 days, he's out of power. Now, this is the thing. They got Gorbachev, but by 1991, there was another political figure who was also very much even more for freedom, more for having a free society than Gorbachev. And he was very vocal as well. So they got Gorbachev, but there was this other political figure named Yeltsin. And so Yeltsin, he also wanted freedom inside of the Soviet Union. And so the communist hardliners went to him as well. The problem is, by now word had spread, and Yeltsin was held up in the parliament building, and as word spreads, mass of people come surrounding the building. And these tanks come towards this mass of people, ordered by these Soviet hardliners. Go get Yeltsin. And the tanks are there, the people are there, and what happens at that moment? Well, the tanks, the soldiers, join the people. They don't fire against Yeltsin and the people who supported him. And so this coup by the communist hardliners failed because they lose support of the people. They lost support of, the soldiers, because the soldiers are tired of living under a communist regime. And in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. It ends. The Cold War is over. Yeltsin emerges as a great hero. He becomes the president of Russia. All these Eastern Bloc nations get their freedom. And, it looks like, hey, everything is great. Everything is wonderful. And for a few years, people are like, yay, everything's good. And then Putin. Who's Putin? Well, about the year 2000, roughly around the year 2000, Putin becomes the new president of Russia. And Putin was former KGB. And Putin, he comes in and he rules for 8 years roughly. And then he served his max terms. And then what he did is he moved his authority from his position to a different position that he would take because he was only allowed to serve 2 terms. Somebody else comes in, basically a puppet, and then Putin comes back in. So basically, Putin has been in charge of the Soviet Union, of Russia, excuse me, from the year 2000, right? And from 2000 up until at least 2020 now, he is the premier or the president of Russia. And during this time period, he has, continued to control Russia in a more dictatorial manner. He got rid of governors. Governors, instead of being elected, are chosen. Freedom of speech is suppressed, and so forth. So in some ways, he's kind of restored this very strict Soviet mentality, even though it's not communist, so to speak. He's very popular. I shouldn't say very popular. He is popular by some people in Russia because he didn't keep Russia strong. And so Russia is strong, he's popular, but there's also people in Russia that don't like him. So where this goes from here, who knows? And where all of Europe goes, we don't know. But this is kind of the whole little storyline of the Cold War from its start all the way at least up to Putin. Where things go from here, we don't know, but we know where we started from. And we started from the period of time of the Middle Ages, if you remember, from when the church had all the power. And then we went through the stories of the rise of the monarchs, the absolute monarchs who ruled through divine right. We went through the period of the Enlightenment and all these new ideas, the French Revolution. We went through a journey that took us through the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, all these events that changed our lives, that made so many things happen into our world today. The stories of the unification of Italy and Germany and colonization, the world wars and the impact those wars had on society, and all the individuals we had talked about all semester. And so I hope you really think back this semester and how much you learned compared to what you knew before and what you know now. So I just want to say thank you for taking this class and listening to all these lectures all semester. I hope you enjoyed it. I always tell students who take a class like this online, that's fine. I hope you liked it. I love lecturing. I can lecture the walls, or in this case, I've been lecturing a screen, and I love it. But I'll be honest with you, I love lecturing in class even more. I think those classes are even better. So I do hope I see a lot of you in other classes that you take the History 110 if you haven't taken that class before, or the History of the Middle East class, the History 165. I always love it when I get students coming back taking more classes. And if you could take it in person, do so. It's so much better. If you like online, that's fine too. Hopefully if you found the lectures interesting and the readings interesting, and you learned a lot. That's kind of the point of this course. And so I do hope you enjoyed it. Again, thank you. And I always kind of tell students to always try to find a positive purpose in life. It's one of my things that I like to encourage students. You want to be happy in life, be grateful for what you have, and then just work hard if you want more. Never see yourself as a victim. That is the fastest way to be miserable. At the end of the day, we are each of us responsible for our success and our happiness in life. And so I always encourage students to have that kind of attitude, because it will get you so far in life. So I do hope you enjoyed the course. You learned a lot, as I said, and keep in touch if you can. I always like hearing from former students as well. And I think I'll just kind of leave you with a little bit of Beethoven and some images from some of the amazing things we've covered this semester. So again, thank you very much. Take care and good luck.